Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Latte on Cloud Cost, the podcast that guides you through the complex world of cloud cost optimization. I'm your host, Praneet Chandra, and I deep dive into strategies, tools, and best practices that helps FinOps professionals, engineering leaders, and DevOps team navigate the financial aspects of cloud computing. In today's episode, we have got Dieter, Senior Cloud Governance Engineer at Roku. We release Cloud FinOps on AWS, GCP, and Azure. So definitely a lot of treasure trove that we are going to unravel today. He has been working on cloud FinOps space since 2013, long before we actually knew the term, right? And at companies like Google, Netflix, Intuit, and Roku. He's a FinOps ambassador, a FinOps certified practitioner, and an AWS subject matter expert in cloud financial management. And if that's not enough, he's also an O'Reilly author and a YouTube creator. So today's session is going to be jam-packed with a lot of great knowledge, right? Welcome, Dieter. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm honored.
Great. So I think before we start everything, would you like to tell our audience a little bit about yourself, what you do at Roku, and what's your role over there?
Yeah, of course. So, as you said, I started my FinOps journey before it was called FinOps, right, in 2013. And the FinOps Foundation was founded in 2019. J.R. Stormont and I actually had a conversation at reInvent, at AWS reInvent in 2016, where he asked me, hey, does this cloud financial management thing have legs, right? And I told him that, it's like working in an industrial kitchen where there is, like half a dozen cooks. You need to clean up every day, right? There's going to be mess, and cleanup is constantly required. If engineers are working, you need to do something to clean up, right? At Roku, I work for the Cloud Center of Excellence. Not everyone in the Cloud Center of Excellence is FinOps focused, right? There are 3 people that are FinOps focused. It's a journey. I've been working there for 4.5 years. In August, it's going to be 5 years, right? So the things that I did in the beginning, they sort of matured over time. The things that I'm working on are very different from what I was doing in the beginning.
Got it. That's great. Yeah. So I think probably when you and JR met, it was long back, right? So what was at that point it was called? Some kind of cloud financial management, FinOps? Like, tell us a little bit more. I think that's the most interesting part. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, right? And I think most people called it cloud cost optimization, but that I think does not include the aspect of, because FinOps is not about saving every dollar. It's about getting the most out of every dollar, right?
Yeah.
So cloud cost optimization was sort of like the early term. And I think between 2016 and 2019, it sort of transitioned to cloud financial management. A financial manager is a person that, let's say, if you have some money and you don't really know how to make it grow, you give it to a financial manager and they will invest it for you for a fee and make sure it grows at a rate that is more than you could do yourself, right? Maybe yourself, you can do like 4 or 5%, and that financial manager will do like 10, 15%, depending on the portfolio and the capabilities, right? So that term financial management existed for a very long time, and cloud financial management sort of is the generic term if you don't want to use FinOps, right? And FinOps, the term itself, right, was coined by the foundation. It is finance and DevOps, right? And it's sort of like a word concatenation between those two terms that we now say FinOps, right? But it really means it's a portmanteau, which is a word concatenation between finance and DevOps, because those are the two teams that need to work together a lot. And it's actually not limited to those 2 personas, right? In the FinOps framework, we know a whole bunch of personas. There is the FinOps practitioner, which is us. And then there is, finance, procurement. In some aspects, there's legal as well involved. And then, of course, engineering and leadership.
Got it. Makes a lot of sense. And thanks for walking us through this backstory, right? We have always been thinking about why FinOps, right? In fact, I remember when I started early and I wrote in one of my slide decks to investors, right? Hey, we are in FinOps space. And they thought us like we are some kind of payroll management company. And I was like, no, we are not a payroll management company. We do cloud cost optimization. So I had to literally go back. But yeah, that's a great thing for everyone to learn. Why does FinOps actually exist as a term and why do you need it, right? And great. Now, zooming in a little bit, I think you talked about Cloud Center of Excellence at Roku, and then few people focused on FinOps as practice. So, what is this Cloud Center of Excellence? I've been hearing of late a lot about it. A lot of companies, I think, are not doubling down on it with multi-cloud and everything coming in. So, can you help us understand what is this Cloud Center of Excellence, how it pictures in terms of multi-cloud setup, and why do companies need it? At what stage companies should do it? I think that is most important. I would not say 4 people, a startup should do it, right? So what is the right stage of doing this thing?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So the Cloud Center of Excellence is sort of a construct, right? Because in a company, you already have verticals, right? So a vertical could be advertising, another vertical could be streaming, another vertical could be data engineering or something like that, right? So you have these verticals, but companies also have horizontals, right? For example, IT, the team that provides laptops to all the employees, right? That's a horizontal. Facilities that provides the office space and the cubes, right? That is a horizontal, right? And then facilities has maybe teams that they contract, like physical security or landscaping or cafeteria, things like that, right? So it can get complex in those areas, right? Even within a vertical, it can get complex. If you take something like TurboTax, right? When I worked at Intuit, that's not just like one team. There's different aspects of that application. And TurboTax has, 20, 30 different teams that are focusing on different aspects of the tax laws, right? And different aspects of the application. So when it comes to cloud, it is advisable that you build this Cloud Center of Excellence, which is sort of like a centralized team, right? That provides governance, policies, and oversight over cloud usage, right? And that includes things like architects, right? So you could have the architects centralized, or you could have the architects decentralized with the different verticals, right? For example, a QuickBooks architect will have different goals or different policies compared to a TurboTax, compared to a Mint or other types of architects, right? So you need to have this kind of decision. And you can have both. You can have architects in the verticals that focus on the product, and you can have architects in the VMware does that, for example, that they have architects in the Cloud Center of Excellence that are sort of focused on what is the best way of using these cloud products and the safest way of doing so. And so the Cloud Center of Excellence provides that guidance around the cloud services. And typically you hear terms like a paved roadmap, right? Or a paved road, where the architect builds a go-to boilerplate template where engineer can work safely in the cloud without, hurting the company or hurting the business, right? And then there's also something called guardrails, right? Where you make sure that when the engineer touches an area where they could make a mistake, right? They are either alerted to that or notified, right? Or it's bouncy, like it's not possible to go further than that. Oh, for example, a guardrail could be if you want to start 100 virtual machines, that's okay. But 1,000 virtual machines, you need some kind of approval process, right? So that's what that Cloud Center of Excellence provides. And remember, so far, I haven't even mentioned a single FinOps policy, right? So FinOps is
Absolutely correct.
exactly right. FinOps is part of that Cloud Center of Excellence and focuses on cloud financial management.
Got it. Makes sense. So if I have to really summarize it down for, let's say, somebody who's thinking of Cloud Center of Excellence, I would say, hey, if you have got large number of disparate teams that sit, right, that are like self-managing, self-governing, self-deploying things as such, and if you want to have a standard practices set across your organization for your cloud investment, use Cloud Center of Excellence. And then within that, if you want to specialize, how do you actually get the maximum ROI of cloud? Set up a FinOps team inside Cloud Center of Excellence. Am I correct?
Sure. That's a good summary. I love it.
Thank you, Dieter. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to simplify it for everyone. I think we have got so many terms floating around, right? A lot of us get confused, like, hey, what should be actually our next strategy, right? Is it crawl, run? Is it like, okay, inform, optimize, and other things? Like, what should we actually do? So I think that's where it makes sense. Zooming a little bit, I think I see a lot of experience of yours doing a multi cloud setup, right? And what I have heard and kind of experience, not really a full thing, it's not an easy thing to do, right? You should have a very strong conviction. You should have a very strong reasons to do multi-cloud setup, right? Multi-region and everything. Okay, disaster recovery and everything becomes a need. You do it, but multi-cloud setup.
Yeah.
So why, since you have a lot of experience on multi-cloud setup, why should a company choose to do a multi-cloud setup? And why, like, if you being a DevOps, if you being a FinOps, how would you make that decision? Like, hey, it's right time we should do multi-cloud, right? And we should have a multi-cloud strategy. But I think what would be the points for and against? That's what I'm trying to ask, right? Like being very candid, right? What is the point for and against, and how does it? How would you decide? Like, should we do multi-cloud setup or not?
That's a very good question, and it will depend on each organization, right? On the needs of the organization. For example, as an FinOps ambassador, I do a lot of outreach, right? A lot of consulting too, free or paid. And there are some organizations, right, where they decided that this vendor is not feasible or technology is not there where they need it to be, and they want to be with another vendor, right? So, for example, before I joined Roku, I also interviewed with other organizations, and one of them was Box.com, Box.com, right? And I interviewed with the CTO there, and the CTO said, I was very surprised that moving from one cloud to another, it's very different, right? And that is true. That is my observation as well. As an example, when you use blob storage on Amazon Web Services and you use lifecycle policies that ages out objects to colder storage tiers, right? At some point, these colder storage tiers need to be rehydrated into a staging area, right? And they stay in that staging area for a certain amount of time, and after that, they simply get deleted. When you look at blob storage, for example, on Google Cloud, it works completely differently. You cannot influence the durations when object times out. There's a static lifecycle policy that cannot be changed. However, when you want to access a colder storage object, it is available within, something like 30 to 50 milliseconds. So it's available right away. There is no rehydration process. However, that object now is in the hottest storage, and to be aged out, it takes, the 365 days to go to the coldest storage. So there are substantial differences within the cloud. And the decision will be organization dependent. At Roku, we made the decision that there is sort of like a certain amount of your cloud spend will be in the data overarching area, right? And looking at the product offerings from one cloud vendor and comparing them to another cloud vendor, we made the decision that some of those offerings, right, that we historically, since like 2019, we used, it will be much easier to use those products from a different cloud vendor, right? So there comes the decision, okay, maybe the data portion has to be moved over, and then there are some applications or in-house services that run on top of that data that would also make sense to be moved over to a different cloud vendor, right? So it is a very organization-specific decision. Dropbox, a different box, right? This is Dropbox this time.
Yeah.
They made the decision to move the blob storage on-prem because they can do cheaper managing their own servers with just spinning disk drives or whatever it is that they are using, right? So it's not just the between cloud vendors, right? But there are some specialized workloads that can be moved on-prem and operated cheaper, right? If you're willing to make, because see, over all the cloud services, someone else is carrying a pager, right? Your team doesn't need to carry the pager. Someone else, if there's an outage, they go and try to fix it, right? So it's a managed service. When you look at the relational database service, right? They have database administrators running around and fixing database problems every day, right? So as a result, while there's economies of scale to provide these cloud products cheaper, right? It is still a managed service. So there is some overhead for that, right? So it is possible to move these things on-prem and potentially run them cheaper than the cloud vendor for narrow use cases, right? So it will be a very organization-specific decision.
Got it. So what I'm hearing is, hey, your use case might be very different, right? And it might be multi-cloud, it might not be multi-cloud. So you should prep for it when you're at a scale, right? Not do it very early. Like, keep me honest over here, right, Dieter? Right?
What?
Not for everyone to do, right? Depends on your use case, depends on your vertical, depends on your one particular use case. I think it's not also about all the use cases as such. That one particular use case that you need to do. And it's not just choices between multi-cloud, it's also versus on-prem. I think I read a very similar from DHH at Basecamp, how they started moving a lot of things to on-prem because they were like, at this point, the S3 cost is unimaginable for us. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I think he also went a little bit more aggressive and went on to like bare metals and all. I don't know how much of that would actually be needed. But I think what I'm hearing, what I'm learning from you is, yes, if the companies have a very specific use case where they think they have exceeded the limits of managed service providers like GCP, Azure, or AWS, that is where they should start looking at multi-cloud, or they should start looking at on-prem and all those opportunities. Correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And while the engineers, of course, love it, right? Because they get to learn, in a sense, for free, right? Another cloud vendor and how to use another cloud, so they can add that to the resume, right? There are some interesting corner cases, like you may have an application that is in maintenance mode. No active development, no bug fixes, nothing, right? And if that application turns out to randomly fail, where you have to restart, like a batch application, right? Where you have to restart, maybe, once or twice a week or once or twice a day. The problem with using it in the cloud is that every restart clocks new usage and you have to pay for it, right? In the data center, the servers are there. It doesn't matter how many times you have to restart that service, right? It's the same cost, right? So there are corner cases for these kind of things as well.
Got it. Makes sense. So one of the things that I would like to ask, and zooming in back to your current company, Roku, right? What are the key challenges that you face or used to face with managing your cloud cost, right? And you can tell us in all the three phases when the company became first aware. I think every company has that moment that you suddenly become aware of your cloud cost or it's spiraling out of control. So what were the challenges back then? How did you folks build out a roadmap? And which state you are in right now, right? Are you like at a place where you have a policy set up and everything and then it goes all great? Yeah, so please enlighten us.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So at Intuit, right, my focus initially was on cloud waste elimination, right? So the first goal was to surface waste, right? To make people aware, because Intuit actually moved from the data center into the cloud. So as you know, there is a lot of articles out there that say 30% cloud waste. Well, our cloud waste was like 25%, turns out, right? So over the 4 years that I worked at that organization, what happened is that we were able to bring our cloud waste down under 5%, and we increased the amount of catch points where we look at waste from 6 to 34, right? So we increased the bar, so to say, right? And we decreased the waste. I also used savings plans once they became available, because there was a point in time in 2019 when they were introduced, right? So I used savings plans and reserved instances to reduce the cloud cost of compute, right? And I did manual RI management, reserved instance management, for the better part of 4 years. So I'm, in a sense, an expert to that. There's a concept called floating inventories. You request a change to your portfolio, and the change may take 5 business days to be implemented, right? And during those 5 business days, you need to keep track of that floating inventory as you apply additional changes, right? So at the 4-year mark, that was running kind of smoothly. So one thing that I did notice is that the organization spent a lot of time forecasting, right? We are talking about each vertical had a small team of like 3 to 5 people doing cloud forecasts, right? So we are talking an easy 30 to 50 people that spent the better part of 6 to 9 weeks, once a year, right? 6 to 9 weeks coming up with the next year's forecast, right? And as it turns out, the forecast variance was somewhere between 35 and 70%, right? So it was quite terrible. I said, like, you know what? We have all those Python libraries, right, that use AI ML for forecasting. Maybe I can just get all the data from the spreadsheets and feed it into that Python library that was called a bag of neural networks. It was just what was default installed, and it was free, of course, right? And I ran that, and I got a forecast variance between 5 and 9% just doing that, right? On my laptop, right? So I showed that to leadership. And while leadership didn't want to use the solution that I built on my laptop, they realized they need a more enterprise level forecasting system, right? But at that time, and even nowadays, there are no really good off the shelf forecasting systems. So, I'm not sure what Intuit did back then, but in 2020, I joined Roku. And the first thing that I looked at, because if you remember, I'm the waste elimination master, right? I looked at waste, and the cloud waste was less than 1%, right? So I'm like, oh my God, I just started at this company, right? And what am I going to do, right? They pay me and I need to add some kind of value. So I did start with like savings plans and reserved instance management, but after 4 to 6 weeks, that is running pretty smoothly. Now what do I do, right? Turns out Roku is actually forecasting when it comes to real estate 10, 15 years in advance, right? That in that country, we need an office. That office needs, 50 or 150 seats, right? We need to create a legal entity in that country so that we can operate, right? And all those kind of things. So cloud cost is actually forecasted 3 years in advance, right? So they needed to build a forecasting system that has a very high accuracy. And I was able to manage to build a forecasting system that has an average variance of 2%. And 2%, just for anyone in the industry, is phenomenal, right? But then after I built that forecasting system, now what do we do, right? So one thing that I did look at is to automate that RI management, right? Because on Amazon Web Services, it's the only cloud provider that has something called convertible RIs, right? And so we are using actually a vendor to manage that. And last October, we switched vendors for that service, right? And after we did that, I noticed that there is a need to manage vendors in general, right? What Roku did is they asked each directly responsible individual or owner to manage their own contracts, right? But we are talking about engineering leaders, possibly senior directors or vice presidents that need to do a lot of different things, and vendor negotiations and contract legal reviews, HR reviews, procurement, that kind of stuff, right? That is something that was challenging for many people, right? And so I offered that the Cloud Center of Excellence, where it is reasonable, they will take care of all the contracts that make sense to manage centrally, right? We are talking about like observability platforms like Datadog, New Relic, Honeycomb, right? Things like Grafana, GitHub, PagerDuty, right? Anything that is not like business unit specific, right? Yeah. We are managing, right? So I'm doing that. And recently I started with actually cloud waste management is, as I mentioned, is still less than 1%, but there is something when it comes to an attack surface, right? If you have an idle database, even though it is, sized properly and it is used only once a month because that's the use case, that's how the workload works, right? We needed to surface those attack spots, right? That when attacker could run like crypto mining or something like that for extensive time periods, multiple weeks, right? And so we started looking into those kind of things and making engineers aware of that.
Oh wow, that's great. That's a quite large expanse of operations, right? That you have been tackling. So I think it's very interesting how you talked about building out forecasting, and that variance of 2% is never heard before. To be very honest, I think Dieter, probably you should expose your magic formula to the rest of the industry. I think a lot of people are suffering, as you said, right? There's no great forecasting tool, right? And the problem with forecasting is, as companies keep on growing, their scale keeps on hitting, it's always difficult to forecast what would be your budget versus variance as such. But yeah, those are a lot of great points. I think for our listeners, this must just sound like magical tunes to their ear, right? Where you can really see that. But I think what I could most importantly take away is always this ever evolving landscape of FinOps or Cloud Center of Excellence as you work with, right? It's not just related to doing for hyperscalers, but also for other horizontal services that my company might use, right? That's a new takeaway for me, right? I think there has been a lot of debate on LinkedIn of late. Should FinOps also entangle software that are used horizontally or infrastructure software? And I think you do have an answer to that, right? Yes, wherever it is used centrally, we should probably use that. When it is a business unit specific, leave it to the business units. But yeah, that's a great way of measuring. And I think there are a couple of players who have started actually measuring the cost from other observability vendor, other data warehousing vendors as well. So
Yeah, exactly.
uh,
I mean, in this industry, if you expect to do the same job for over 5 years, that's probably not a realistic expectation to have, right? Now I see engineers using Copilot more, right, or using AI more. And there is even a term when you're writing code and you stop typing because you're waiting for Copilot to autocomplete, right? It's called the Copilot pause, right? That hasn't existed like 2 years ago, right?
exactly.
And now like the engineer types furiously, it goes and then that stops and waits for Copilot to the for loop or whatever that is, right? They complete that and then they keep doing. So, and I have now seen, but that is like highly experimental, right? Where engineers just talk to the computer, right? And they use GitHub, they use version control. And if something doesn't work, roll back to this version, try again, right? And it's just a voice interface, right? There is no more typing. So there will be changes in the industry. And if you expect to...
I do know one engineer who actually was talking to his cursor and could show me like what he actually does, and I was like, this is crazy, right? And though I have lost all the programming jobs now, right, but I would be like, hey, let me just get cursor, I can probably become expert at XYZ language, start, I know the logic, but I just don't know how to code anymore, right? Like, we have not been familiar with latest tech. And after seeing him, I was just like, hey, I can also do this, right? But I think the nuances come a lot more, right? Like, it was just a overstatement that I would call. But I think that's interesting to see, right? And as you said, right, if you look at the industry, it's not more than 5 years, right? How much more would you actually extract? I think it becomes at a point maintaining everything as compared to like new initiatives, new progression as such. Great. One of the key things that I hear from a lot of customers or a lot of people I talk with, right, these engineering leaders is, hey, how do we use modernization, right? Cloud providers keep on releasing a lot of instances every now and then, right? So how should we think about modernization? And do you have any specific techniques, any specific anecdotal examples from the past where you have actually used a lot of modernization? It would be great for our viewers to hear as such.
Modernization is a very broad topic, right? And it will be, again, specific to your organization, and not just that, specific to certain areas of your organization, right? For example, I met, because I do a lot of licensing and SaaS, that is the capability, right? Where I do vendor negotiations, I do renewals. The renewals need to go for a legal review, procurement is involved, finance is involved, right? I actually met with the procurement team and they walked me through all the changes that were happening on their side, right? So those can be process changes, but also the process interact with the software, right? And there's software updates, right? The workflow tool that we have been using for the last 5 years, right? It looks completely different today than it used to, right? It's, in a sense, if I would not have been using it on a daily or weekly basis, right, I would need new training on it, right? But the changes were so minute that over time I was just able to adapt, and I don't need additional training because I got so used to the tool, right? And then there will be very specific things like, for example, when it comes to video encoding, right? There is a gazillion encoding algorithms I wouldn't have even imagined. Let's say you have a very widescreen format, right? And there's a person talking on one side and a person talking on another side. When you do that on a phone, right? What the encoding algorithm can do is move those two people closer so that they fit on your phone, right? So there is a lot of interesting stuff going on to make another encoding algorithm makes dark backgrounds darker, crisper, right? So there is a transition between the light and the dark so that on a OLED display, right, the dark areas actually look nicely dark and not just like a dark gray, you know? And so when it comes to video encoding, the team is constantly looking at new algorithms, right? And also new vendors, right? Because maybe you start in the cloud and you use a cloud native service, right? And if you can run with that cloud native service for several years and it's still good, then there's no change required. But as you are at the forefront of that innovation, right, your team may build in-house algorithms or may find vendors with third-party algorithms, right, that beat the cloud-native algorithms. And often, it could be just a quality improvement, maybe at a higher cost. But my experience is that it's not just a quality improvement, you also get it at a lower cost, right? Because these vendors know that they need to compete with the cloud providers. So the entire modernization is a very complex and large area. And another thing that we did is we use Confluence internally, right? Whenever I need some engineering work done, I open a Jira ticket, which is Confluence own, and the Jira ticket then will be assigned by a manager to an engineering team, to a sprint, right? That entire Confluence system was run sort of like in an on-prem cloud, right? So in a private cloud. However, what the challenge with that is that software upgrades, now you are responsible for that, right? There is a division of responsibilities, and doing those software upgrades is quite an undertaking. And Confluence is like down for the entire weekend. So Friday at 5 p.m., right, I can log off and I don't have to worry because this thing will be down until Monday morning anyways, right? I don't even have to check what's going on there. So we decided to move it to the cloud, right, and use it as a SaaS offering, software as a service, right? And that Confluence migration probably was one of the most painful experiences that I had with the software. Not only that the look and feel substantially changed, right? All the existing Confluence pages, and there were tens of thousands of them, right, had to be migrated to the new system. And the migration was sort of like into a staging area, right? And then when you started looking at the page, if no one looked at the page, that's it. Nothing changed, right? And it wouldn't be upgraded or migrated to the latest version. But if you started working with that page, it asked you, hey, do you want to migrate to the new version? And all of a sudden, some functionality that you had before stopped existing, right? But new features started becoming available, right? So that was a quite painful experience. And, you may see something similar, maybe moving from Microsoft to Google Docs, right? Or the other way around, where the user interface is substantially different, right? And that's just something that we actually asked our CEO, why did we do that? Right? It took us like 3 weeks to, not the migration was like 2 days or something like that, but to get used to the new system, right? It was quite painful. We had the Slack channel. You could ask questions in the Slack channel and then they would address those questions, right? Why did we do that, right? And the CEO said, guys, you have no idea how old that system was. It was limping around. We knew for several years we need to go migrate to the SaaS offering, right? And it was better just to rip the Band-Aid off than to just keep limping. The Roku engineers are smart, they are rock stars, they can handle it.
Definitely. I think the most important point I learned, right, that modernization always helps with a better quality at a cheaper price. And it's always wise to take some of these modernization decisions, not being architecturally bound that, hey, I'm going to use this, so let's keep it over there, right? If it actually needs and the industry is moving in that space, we should, right? Correct.
Yeah,
Great.
exactly.
Yeah, cool. I think that takes me to one of the most interesting questions, right, that I like to ask. If cloud cost optimization had a secret ingredient, what would be that in your experience?
On a good question. On a high level, right, there you have rate and usage optimization, right? If it comes to cost.
Correct.
There's many other things, right? There is certainly governance and policy as well. For example, some services that are prohibitively expensive, right, to run for extended time periods in the cloud. They were meant to be used for troubleshooting, right, for very short bursts. And, I don't want to name any services, but many people out there will know that one service that you can only turn on for minutes or low amount of hours. Otherwise, it will rack up, thousands or tens of thousands of costs, right? They're not meant to be run continuously, right? So policy and governance has its place. Architecture definitely has its place. I've seen engineers build things that are not practical, right, and have feasibility impact as well. Just because it's a knowledge issue, right? How does the engineer know that this is the best way of doing something? Well, if you're lucky, they do. Otherwise, they don't, and you need to teach them. So there's teaching again as an aspect, right? And teaching has to be continuous because those cloud providers don't stop innovating, right? They come up with new product, essentially every quarter. For example, Amazon Web Services has a weekly newsletter that shows all the line items. And that thing has like a good 80 line items on it every week, right? There's small things like on RDS, you can now use Postgres version this, right? Small little advances, right? But there will be big ones too. We just released a new VM family, right? So there are many aspects to that, right? But on a very high level, there is rate and usage optimization. Rate optimization can be done centrally, right? Usage optimization can be surfaced centrally, but has to be decentralized, done by the engineers, right? So it's harder to do because the engineers have work to do, they have deliverables, right? And now you come and ask them, hey, we have this usage optimization here that you can look at. By the way, the best way to handle that is either to have a dedicated sprint just to usage optimization or have a portion of a sprint, like 10, 15%, right, of your time is being continuously spent on usage optimization. But as I mentioned, rate optimization can be done centrally. And there is a lot of different things under rate optimization. Negotiation is one of those aspects, right? And negotiation, for the most part, is relatively short, right? I mean, how many hours do you really negotiate with vendors? I mean, 10, 15 hours total over maybe a time period of like 2-3 months, right? But how many of those meetings do you have? Not that many, I hope. I just recently renewed with Microsoft, and let me tell you, that was one of the longest ones. It certainly exceeded 15 hours. But with most vendors, I mean, it's like 5, 10, 15 hours. I do $1 million contracts over email and Slack, right? I don't care. I just tell the vendor, dude, you know what you want. I know what I want. Let's just talk and get this done, right? Send the order form and we iterate on that. So $1 million contract, I'm brutal like that. But the rate optimization is also savings plans, right? If you're not using savings plans and your compute cost is substantial, right? Let's say 20, 30% of your cloud bill, look into savings plans, right? They are, or maybe on the GCP side, they have flexible committed use discounts as opposed to resource-based committed use discounts, which is equivalent to those RIs, right? And then on Azure, they also have savings plans and reserved instances as well, right? Look into savings plans as soon as possible because it's essentially a high watermark that you purchase. I purchased $100 an hour for 3 years, right? That's $2.6 million commitment over the 3 years, right?
Yeah.
And you get savings immediately, right? Like 34% or something like that, right? The savings actually on the AWS side are not static. They depend on the VM type that you're using, and each VM type will have different savings. In each region, it will be different, right? And maybe we can do a podcast talking about that if that's interesting, right?
No, that is.
Yeah. So savings plans is one thing to get started, but the next thing that I highly, highly recommend, right? If you look at your usage, right, and usage is flat over the day, flat over the week, and flat over the month, you're running the cloud as a data center. We can have another argument. This is not how you should be running cloud, right? But if your usage goes up and down within a 24-hour time period, or within a week, or within a month, right, look into convertible reserved instances on the Amazon Web Services side, right? We don't know how long these will be offered, but even for the next 3 to 5 years is an absolute must, right? We were using savings plans and saving about 20% of our total cloud bill, right? I mean, you can tell a 3-year savings plan has 34%, right? So 20% is less than that because our cloud bill is not just compute.
Obviously, waste. Yeah.
Exactly. And when we've switched from savings plans to a managed reserved instance vendor, that vendor immediately saved us 4% in addition, right? So if you are spending, let's say, 100 million in annually, that's $4 million, right? Imagine how many engineers you can hire with that, right? That's 16 engineers out of nowhere for free, right? So my secret sauce is look into that because it's the easiest tip that I can give you.
I totally buy into that. I think it is very important to look at rate optimization as centrally owned thing, something that FinOps or CCOE or somebody at centrally who owns it, and then usage optimization has to be local, right? And the local essence has to be important for, I think, 2 big reasons, right? A lot of companies think, hey, it's a period activity, let's do it, when it actually starts becoming a pain. What I have started advising to CTOs and head of engineering is, hey, you do tech debt, right? Every quarter, every month, you'll pick out some time for tech debt. Why don't we treat cloud debt in a similar way? Treating it as a cloud debt is a great way of getting your team motivated. What do you do in tech debt? You go and fix the services where you've got gaping holes and other things. Do the same thing with cloud debt and actually solves a lot of problems. So I think that's a wonderful way of putting that. And I definitely agree. Convertible RIs and savings plan combinations do a lot of job for us. And I think as long as they're available, we should use the best use of it, right? So bringing me to the last question in our today's conversation, Dieter, right? And this is something that I try to ask because a lot of people come to us like, hey, what is FinOps and everything? So if I'm starting my career today in FinOps or cloud cost optimization space, what would be your recommendations to me? Right? Oh, where should I start? Why should I start?
Starting on FinOps. Okay, good. I mean, here's the thing, right? The FinOps Foundation did a fantastic job posting the FinOps framework on the foundation website. And it's all free to use, right? Look at that. It's free. Look at content that is for free, let's say on YouTube, right? And let's say if you're an O'Reilly, if you already have an O'Reilly subscription, that gives you access to all O'Reilly content, right? I have actually a course on O'Reilly that you can watch. It is not free, but it is free with a subscription that you can watch. And I go through all 22 capabilities. And I tell you how to get started with a capability and what are the most common pitfalls that you will see in that capability. And absolutely what is a must, right? Get FinOps certified. Become a FinOps practitioner at the minimum, right? Because the FinOps space is a new space. It's an early space. I mean, 2019, right? It was actually, the founding was in February, right? So we are like 6 years into this. But become certified to differentiate yourself from other people, right? Because the certification will ensure that you have a minimum knowledge that you bring to the table, right? The test that you have to pass is actually 50 questions. You get 60 minutes. And so maybe for like someone where English is a second language, I'm not sure if there's other languages being provided. It's quite possible. But for me to just read through 50 questions and all the multiple choice answers, it takes about a minute, right? It's not an easy undertaking. And you can only answer a couple questions wrongly. I forget how many it is, like 6 or 7, maybe 7 is already too much, right? So it will ensure that you have a minimum knowledge set, right? And so when people are hiring for that position, they look for those certifications to ensure that they get a quality resource on board.
Got it. That makes sense. And thank you. Yeah, this is like, I think we should also go and take Dieter's course if you've got O'Reilly's subscription. I'll definitely post in the link, right, about this one. So whenever you're watching this video, you'll definitely have this in link. And that brings us to the end of this podcast. Thank you, Dieter. Thanks for your time. It was lovely talking to you. I think we are just barely scratching the surface. I think I was just doing this thing and I was like, oh, I can actually talk to Dieter for another 2 hours and there'll still be enough things to talk. So thanks once again. And I hope that we do these deep dive sessions. I think we have picked up a couple of them like CRIs, savings plan. Probably I would love to have a deep dive session with you again, how we can do much better things with CRIs and let everyone learn. I think for far too long we have been like restricting ourselves in terms of, hey, should we share this knowledge? Is this a proprietary knowledge? No, I think all of us should just benefit from it, right? So yeah,
I agree.
thank you, Dieter.
The more
Thanks for
the better. Absolutely. Thanks for having me. You take care.
Thank you.